Have you ever seen a prize fight? If not, you have a pleasure to come. It is a most complete thing. It teaches men to admire true courage, to applaud generosity, to acquire notions of honor and greatness of mind. It teaches also to show humanity and not triumph over a fallen foe. Likewise, it clearly points out to despise a coward. So damned be him who first cries, hold, enough.
In October 1805, an extraordinary contest took place at a secret location near London. It was violent, dangerous, and highly illegal. For the first time, a black man had entered an arena that England regarded as hers and hers alone, the bare-knuckle prize ring. He was born an American slave, but he was to become an English hero. And the climax of his career was to be the greatest sporting event of the century. They called him the Black Terror. And this is his true story. Black men were a familiar sight on the streets of the nation's capital in the early 1800s. There were more than 15,000 of them in London, from all corners of the globe. Washed-up sailors, traveling musicians, slaves on the run. Most of them lived in poverty, surviving on whatever charity they could find. Bill Richmond was in a different class. By the time he retired from the prize ring, Bill had the whole of London eating out of the palm of his hand. Against all odds, he'd become the world's first black superstar. The poet Lord Byron wrote about Bill, and even the king wanted to meet him. As for the great British public, they lapped him up. Each week, they read all about him in the underground prize-fighting magazine, Boxiana. It was published by Bill's #1 fan, top boxing journalist of the day, Pierce Egan.
This pugilistic hero of colour stands nearly unrivaled in the prize ring. The right hand is truly dreadful. 2 hits from it, applied, can produce the severity to decide a contest. Yet, however engaged in the art of milling, he is not so absorbed in fighting as to be incapable of discourse upon other subjects. He is intelligent, communicative. In fact, he can be rather facetious over a glass of Noyeux. He is an extraordinary man.
Yet when he was born, Bill's prospects in life were about as bad as they came. He was a slave. Bill and his mother lived on Staten Island near New York. They were the sole property of one Richard Charlton, the parson in a backwater known as Cuckoldstown. If he stayed put, the chances were he wouldn't make it past 35. And if he ran, he faced a beating, or worse. But when he was 13, an English aristocrat, Lord Percy, came to dine at the parsonage, and Bill spotted an opening.
He's someone who's been brought up in a fairly educated household, so he's going to know how to behave around a variety of people. So he'll be accustomed to a household which has servants and slaves and masters and mistresses and how they behave in front of their social superiors. So he's going to have a degree of social skills. He's quite adroit and something of an operator.
For the English nobility of the day, a black servant was a must-have fashion accessory. Lord Percy took an instant shine to the bright young slave boy.
Bill is a young man who's got a bit of get up and go. What you see with him is someone who can take his chances. This is it for me, this is my big moment.
God save the king.
By catching the eye of Lord Percy, Bill had earned himself a passage to England and freedom. His new life, not a slave, but a servant at the luxurious Percy family pile, Alnwick Castle in Northumberland.
Thousands of English people would have been dying to get a job like that, because to get a job like that meant that you were afforded the protection of this great man. You know, you took on some of his status. You know, your status depended on his greatness. You weren't a servant to some second-rate cheap merchant in London, you know. You had access to all the aesthetic artifacts. You could steal a bit of the sherry. You could look around at the master's books. You could admire the paintings. You know, you lived in a very genteel and ornate ambience. And some of these black people took advantage of this learned and cultured environment.
Bill needed no encouragement. He taught himself to read. The general even sent him to school. And when he turned 17, Percy set Bill up as an apprentice cabinet maker in the city of York. An ambitious young black man like Bill couldn't have picked a better time to be striking out on his own.
1780 is probably the best time to have been alive in Britain as a black person, because you have a major abolition movement starting, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Hundreds of thousands of people from all social classes went to the streets to protest on behalf of black people. I mean, it's a massive social movement that, that meant that there was a great deal of sympathy in this country for the ideas of justice and decency and fairness and freedom.
Bill used that freedom to establish himself as a craftsman. But on the back streets of York, the liberal mood wasn't shared by everybody.
On passing through the streets of York one evening, with a female under his protection, Richmond was accosted by one Frank Myers, brothel keeper, with the epithet Black Devil. Myers insulted the young woman for being in the company of a man of colour. Bill, with a most becoming spirit of indignation, soon taught him that it was wrong, and beneath the character of an Englishman, to abuse an individual on account of his country or his colour. Myers, very properly, received a complete milling.
By the 1790s, milling had been a popular spectacle on British streets for at least a century.
If there's one thing that struck Europeans about the English in the 18th century, it was their, well, they saw them as being primitive and brutal, a kind of people on the edge of Europe who enjoyed beer, beef and boxing. And the English, in fact, revelled in this. They said that's why British soldiers win battles, because they're used to stripping to the waist and standing firm and punching people. This makes them tough and physical, and if there's one thing that the French can't cope with, it's a tough Englishman, and he's bayonet.
Bare-knuckle boxing was a shady world, operating on the very edge of the law. It had its own unofficial championship, contested only by Britain's toughest men.
The boxing stars took on enormous status. All young boys wanted to be like the great fighters, and they knew them by name. Their vital statistics, their height, their weight, their reach was in every paper. Every schoolboy would have known all of this.
The top fighters took up ring names like the Grave Digger, the Jawbreaker, and the Bristol Butcher. They were a community of heroes who fought for honor and big money.
There are various travelling shows which go around the country that people look forward to and know is going to happen. But when a fight happens, it's in a sense a bit extra to this. So the word would go round and people in communities would take the day off if they possibly could.
And people would bring food out, and you can just sort of hear the whole thing, and jugglers would appear and fire eaters, and everybody had a good time, including the pickpockets.
To the authorities, these rowdy gatherings spelled trouble. But the pull of a prize fight was hard to control. They'd spring up at fairgrounds or race meetings, where anyone could get up and try their hand in the ring. It was on such an occasion in 1796 that Bill Richmond entered the records of boxing history.
Bill's first display in the pugilistic art was with one George Moore, better known by the name of Docky, who insulted Bill upon the course at York during the time of the races. This Docky had been the terror of Sheffield and had ruled the roost for some time in that part of the country.
Come on, let's have you.
Bill's friends advised him from attempting to fight such a man, Bill weighing only 10 stone 12 pounds, but he was not to be deterred. And in the course of some 20 minutes, our hero punished Docky so completely that he gave in and was taken away, totally blind.
What the heck?
To understand what an 18th century prize fight was like, I think you've got to deliberately shed all the images you've got of modern boxing. Here was a contest which was a mixture between boxing and wrestling. There were throws as well as blows.
Basically, it was decided by the umpires at the moment what was allowed. And quite often this would depend upon who the crowd was roaring for.
It was a very, very bloodthirsty business out there.
They were allowed to kick. The favourite target was the kidneys, quite often delivered with a blow called the chopper. Another way of stopping a fight very, very quickly.
You had to be made of pretty stern stuff to stand in this ring, knowing you could be there for 2 hours.
Throws, I mean, imagine being thrown over the shoulder and landing on your head. Knuckling the eyes, headbutting.
Bill Richmond's victory over Docky Moore was no fluke. He soon earned a reputation on the local boxing scene. But his only reward was a handful of coppers collected from the racegoers.
What every sportsman in England in the 18th century wanted was a patron. Men with money. If you could get noticed by one of the patrons and take some of their money off them, that was really your ideal. It's like having a sponsor in the modern world. It opened doors socially. It provided money and security in a world that didn't really have any guarantees on either.
Bill's exploits on the fringes of the boxing world soon got him spotted by one of the prize ring's most well-connected backers, Lord Camelford. London beckoned. Camelford was the classic upper-class playboy. He was a wayward cousin of the Prime Minister, with a taste for riotous living.
Lord Camelford had this reputation for dressing down, for living low, which was really quite popular in that age, where gentlemen, by putting on the clothes of a lower social class, you could pretend to be one of them. You could go to the sleaziest of taverns and do the most disreputable things, and he'd get away with it. He lived in this twilight world between the down and outs and the lordly, moneyed class.
Camelford was a man of many vices, and at the top of his list came gambling.
There had been a revolution in France, there were revolutions all over Europe, and people were terrified. They thought that there was going to be one in England. If you inherited a large fortune, you might not live to spend it, so why not gamble with it? And so they did. People were beginning to be a bit embarrassed about bear baiting and cockfighting, so they were looking for something else violent to bet on. The violent thing they found then was pugilism.
Lord Camelford introduced Bill to the high temple of the boxing world, the Fives Court on St. Martin's Lane. Gentlemen flocked there to soak up the atmosphere and rub shoulders with London's elite community of prize fighters. Bill liked what he saw, but to chance his arm in the prize ring's top flight would be a prospect fraught with danger.
You could easily disfigure your hands if you were unlucky in the ring. Therefore, you could not go back to the only craft you had, which was cabinet making, which is all about manual dexterity. And to hang up his cabinet maker's tools and to go into boxing was an enormous risk, but he would have had to have a lot of self-belief, you know, and an enormous amount of ambition, you know, to seize this opportunity and to say to himself, look, I could either make it now or I'll be poor all my life.
All through the year of 1800, Bill prepared for his professional debut. With his livelihood as a craftsman in the balance and Camelford's cash riding on the outcome, failure was not an option.
Richmond's first public set-to in London was in Blackheath with a whip maker by the name of Green. A purse of 10 guineas was made up on the spur of the moment after a dinner in Bob's Chop House. The battle raged with fury for some time, but the man of colour got the whip hand of Green in such style that after 10 minutes he cried out, "Enough!"
The fact that Bill could not just box but batter and beat to a pulp white people in Britain tells you about the kind of paradoxical nature of not just the British character but British society. Britain dominates the slave trade, and at the same time it allows you space for self-expression and self-betterment. So people like Bill are able to move up because of their individual skill and talent.
Bill and his patron made the perfect team. Camelford's cash did the walking, and Bill's fists did the talking. And while Bill bashed his way up the ranks of the London prize-fighting scene, Camelford sat back and counted his winnings. By the spring of 1805, the Black Terror was ready to take on the best.
Richmond is conspicuous in his gaiety. He's full of milling. Oh, some tremendous faces from Richmond. And the Jew concedes he can take no more.
Bill Richmond was relatively small, often fighting men of much greater weight. There were no weight divisions. Richmond would have been forced to move around a lot more, switching, shifting, trying to traverse or go to the side of the man, try and draw the man forward so he could hit on the counter. By moving constantly backwards, what you did was make the man step forward, in much the same way as Muhammad Ali. Some people thought he shifted too much, i.e. cowardice thing, but in fact he was being sensible, moving away from a bigger man and moving in when it was safe to do so.
By rights, Bill was too small to take on the largest fighters, but his unique style floored all comers. And by the autumn of 1805, the Black Terror was judged to be one of England's best pugilists.
Richmond could make 100 guineas in one night. It's a lot of money in that time. And so boxing, his fists, his brawn got him to where he was, which is a terrific statement about how he overcame slavery. Because in the slave period, black people were defined according to their physiques. They were just valued for their physique. You know, they were just muscle with a cutlass at the end of the muscle and a lot of cane or cotton at the end of that cutlass. So Richmond used this physique, the thing that defined him as a slave, to acquire national prominence.
Bill's sights were now set on the championship of the prize ring. But one man stood in his path. A giant by the name of Tom Cribb.
Cribb was very good. All one can say, I think, with a fair amount of certainty, is that modern heavyweights wouldn't stand much chance. It's a question of the hands. Cribb could punch the bark off a tree. Now just think about that. I mean, his knuckles were so hard that there was a sort of horny covering on them, apparently.
At 14 stone and almost 6 feet tall, Cribb was a man-mountain by the standards of the day. He was a Bristol docker who'd been hauling coal on river barges since the age of 9. Then he'd served against Napoleon in the Royal Navy. The boxing fraternity couldn't get enough of him.
The great thing about him was he would not quit. Cribb wouldn't give in, ever. And that, I think, is what they admired about him. He's a sort of John Bull figure, that he embodied all the English virtues. Steady, strong, resolute, and never surrender.
In January 1805, Bill went to see Cribb take on one George Maddox, a prizefighter renowned for his powers of resilience. Maddox was beaten to within an inch of his life.
You know, they call it the science, they call it the fancy, they call it the art. A lot of the fights were just very, very brutal, slugging it out until one guy dropped down, sometimes dead, in a society where that would mean the absolute impoverishment of his family.
Lord Camelford thought it suicide for Bill to even enter a ring with Cribb. His man was 16 years older and more than 3 stone lighter. It was one gamble Camelford wasn't prepared to take. But in 1805, Camelford's wild ways caught up with him. He got himself killed in a duel of honor. To some boxers, it would have been a disaster. But for Bill, it was the perfect opportunity to renegotiate. With London's top promoters chasing him, Bill was now able to set himself up with a juicy payday against the champion-in-waiting, Tom Cribb.
Richmond is entitled to a unique niche among the heroes of the milling art as a practical and as a theoretical pugilist. His knowledge is all intuitive, having never received lessons from the professors. In the ring, he is considered to excel most other pugilists in the art of hitting and getting away.
But Cribb, Tom Cribb,
the only thing we had ever trained was a poodle. The act was getting so big that we needed a third person. The 3 of us, we became lovers. It was just something that happened that was beautiful. I almost think like it never happened, like it was a dream. I don't want to remember how it all ended.
I have someone here. Someone just got bit by a tiger.
The bizarre story of how fate tore apart the cat dancers.
Feels good, eh? Feels very good. Watch Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall take on Britain's top foodies. The Big Food Fight, Tuesday at 10 on 4.
In October 1805, Admiral Nelson's fleet sailed for the Cape of Trafalgar to fight Napoleon's navy. It was to be one of the most crucial conflicts Britain had ever faced. But back in London, a very different battle was grabbing the headlines.
A Richmond-Cribb fight took up far more column inches in the paper than the sailing of Nelson's fleet. The fact that Nelson was about to close on the French-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar may have got a little notice here and a little notice there, whereas the build-up to the fight, there would have been all sorts of stuff. People writing about the training, how many people were expected to turn up, where it was to be. The inns for miles around were packed with people.
A few minutes before 12 o'clock on the 8th of October, 10,000 people watched and waited as Bill threw his hat into the ring in the customary challenge. It was showtime.
Richmond is hitting and retreating neatly. Cribb tries to close. Oh, Cribb is furious. He's following Richmond round the ring, but he can't seem to find his opponent.
Richmond was lighter, quicker, agile, clearly much more athletic. One thing he knew against men who were younger, bigger and heavier was not to stand there and to be hit. He knew how to use his feet and he knew how to get out of trouble. He was accused, when he used that tactic against Cribb, of acting like a clown, skipping out of way, avoiding the blows and not being hit, and Cribb couldn't put a fist on him. The embarrassment to Cribb of not being able to land a punch for a very, very long time really niggled him. The two men clearly disliked each other.
The man of colour is all alive. He's cutting more capers than a chef preparing a sauce for a leg of mutton.
For 20 minutes, Bill danced his way round the bigger man. And after 18 rounds, it seemed the impossible was about to happen.
And Cribb is down! Cribb is down!
When a fighter was on the ground, then the round was stopped. There was an interval, 30-second interval, and then after 30 seconds they came back and started all over again. And the fight only ended when one fighter couldn't be brought back to scratch.
Bill produced a virtuoso display of pugilism. But with a knockout the only way to end a fight, Bill's size started to find him out. After 1.5 hours of battering, Cribb's extra weight began to tell.
Richmond's knuckles are lacerated miserably. His features are disfigured. The man of colour cannot possibly win.
In 60 punishing rounds, the Black Terror had been beaten. But he wasn't finished yet. Bill had calculated shrewdly. His sheer audacity in taking on a man like Cribb was the perfect way to win friends and influence people. The contest cemented Bill's reputation as a technically brilliant boxer. Now it was time to cash in. Bill knew his best years in the ring were behind him, so he hatched a new plan: to create London's first public boxing academy.
Richmond was obviously somebody with a lot of drive and a lot of ambition. He could have easily retired on the proceeds of his long career as a boxer. His social status was no doubt increased by running this academy. You know, it gave him a position in society.
It becomes one of the sort of fashionable things, I suppose, like, you know, these days everybody's doing sweat yoga or something. Those days, if you're really, really posh, you would go and do a couple of rounds in Bill's boxing academy.
The fact that he was black meant that there was this kind of certain excitement or social cachet in going to be trained by him.
The academy was a runaway success. Gents flocked to Richmond's rooms to spot potential talent for the prize ring and to bask in the reflected glow of Bill's stardom. Bill had a dozen members of Parliament on his books. Even the poet Lord Byron enjoyed a bit of punishment.
Richmond's decision to open this public house stroke boxing academy is probably his masterpiece, because all at once you have this location for the wealthy gambling population. They can go and slake their thirsts, lay bets, organize. It's a place where writers and people from all sorts of society go. But most of all, this is a place where Richmond can groom his own stable of boxers.
Now in his 40s, it seemed that Bill had it all. Money, respect, and a cozy niche in London's high society. But he was about to be pitched right back into the turmoil of the prize ring. Nobody knows for sure where Tom Molyneux came from. He said he was a Virginia cotton slave who'd won his freedom in a prize fight. He claimed to be the American champion. Now he wanted to take on England's best, and he wanted Bill to help him. The big man looked good, but could he box? He could box.
Richmond saw his potential. I mean, Richmond was very streetwise and boxing-wise and knew the sporting scene inside out. And he obviously thought, I can do something with this character.
The wounds of Bill's defeat at the hands of Tom Cribb had cut deep. And to add insult to injury, Bill's arch-rival had gone on to become the undisputed English champion. But in Molyneux, he'd found a crude, raw fighter, 6 foot and 14 stone of pure muscle. And what he lacked in style, he made up for with sheer power.
Richmond had this burning desire to get that championship. He couldn't win it himself, but Molyneux could win it.
Bill used all his contacts to fix Molyneux up with a trial fight. His adversary was to be a hard case from Bristol by the name of Tom Tough. And to add a little spice to the contest, Bill had picked an opponent who was trained by Tom Cribb himself. The American was a sensation. Molyneux disposed of Cribb's protege with contempt. It was a calculated slap in the face for the champion. Honor and the entire boxing world now demanded satisfaction. The big fight was on. For the first time in history, a black man would now contest the boxing championship of all England. And for some, it was one step too far.
Richmond, he's clearly aware that the fact that he hadn't achieved the championship allowed him a special place in the nation's affections. Here was someone who had failed, but failed well and failed nobly. Richmond, he wasn't a serious threat to the national identity. Suddenly, along comes Tom Molyneux, who is.
At his academy in London's West End, Bill knuckled down to coach his protege in the finer points of the pugilistic arts. But there were some rough edges that weren't so easily knocked off.
Suddenly, here was the greatest city in the world, wide open to him. And wine, women, and song. And he jumped in head first.
London looked on in horror as the uncouth Virginia slave publicly helped himself to the city's dirtiest pleasures.
Richmond said to him, look, boy, this is England. You know, we have to behave in certain ways. We have to be role models. If you were to get on in society, don't swear so much. Wash your hands. Eat with a knife and fork. Imitate the behavior of an English gentleman, but don't ever think that you're an English gentleman. Know your place. Richmond would have tried to take the paganism out of Molyneux because it was taken out of him. I use that in inverted commas, those terms. And of course he failed, gloriously.
The Cribb-Molyneux match had now become far more than just a boxing contest. At stake was nothing less than the soul of the nation.
Tom Cribb, the champion. He is a man celebrated in popular songs as, well, if Napoleon invades us, we'll just set Tom Cribb on him. The French don't stand a chance.
On the 18th of December, of a fight I will sing, when both Cribb and Molyneux, they have entered the ring.
You'd have seen every road clogged with these ants inching their way down every lane, every main road, every side road, across every stile, all going towards this same spot. There was a madness about being there. You tell your children and grandchildren, I was there.
With hope and expectation and our hearts beating high, while the rain poured in torrents from a dark lowering sky.
The whole country was interested. It was the greatest sporting event of the century.
The black strips appeared of a giant-like strength, large in bone, large in muscle, with arms a cruel length.
The main emotional thrust of this contest in the heart of England was one about identity. Can the title be held by a non-Briton? Can the title be held by a black person?
With skin black as ebony, Cribb as white as snow, they shook hands like good fellows, then to it they did go.
This is a battle of tremendous skill and desperation. Cribb receives a dreadful blow to the mouth that makes his teeth chatter.
Cribb had gravely underestimated the American. For 18 rounds, Molyneux soaked up his best shots and returned them blow for blow.
Molyneux would just keep coming at you. There was no respite. He wouldn't let his opponents back up and take a rest. He would just keep on at them and keep on at them and keep on at them. And it's quite disconcerting to have a man like that just won't let you go. Even if you're hurting him badly, he still just keeps coming at you. But a bit of the attitude of the Mike Tyson.
Cribb plants a tremendous blow over Molyneux's eyebrows.
When Cribb punched him in the eye and hurt him very badly, Molyneux's response was just to charge at the man, pick him up and throw him to the floor.
Cribb and his supporters were shocked by the power and ferocity of the black man's attack.
And we know that people shouted quite openly, "Don't let the nigger beat you, don't let old England down." Because it was thought that the valor and the fortitude shown by boxers were the kind of virtues that the English possessed. It was the kind of virtues that led them to build an empire. So that if Tom Molyneux is showing these values, obviously it was seen by some people as a kind of a threat to the whole edifice of British superiority.
After 30 minutes, both men were badly battered. But in the 19th round, the Englishman began to crack.
Cribb is got by Molyneux against the ropes. Oh, the champion appears exhausted.
As his old rival sank to his knees, Bill Richmond looked on and savored the sweet taste of success.
I suppose Richmond, being a black man who was white but not quite there, probably would have had a sense of revenge. You would have thought, yes, yes, all this that I had to suffer in England, all this whiteness that I had to acquire, all this politeness coming out of my mouth, you know, there would have been a kind of sense of revenge, you see. All this that I had to suffer in England, all this whiteness that I had to acquire, all this politeness coming out of my mouth, you know, there would have been a kind of sense of revenge, you see.
think it struck a nerve about the superiority of the British male and their vulnerability at a time of war and so on. They really couldn't handle the idea that they weren't superior. And all of these things came together in this very, very, very ugly episode, one of the ugliest episodes, I think, in the history of British sport.
In the 19th round, the mob ran riot.
People were pushed to one side, people were trampled, people were lying on the ground, people walking all over them. I mean, who knows what happened? Molyneux was trapped in a corner and one of his hands was broken. It must have been a terrifying experience.
The ring invasion gave Cribb vital breathing space, and it left Molyneux with a broken hand. With his jaw shattered and 6 ribs broken, he fought on for round after round. It was hopeless. And in the 40th, the English crowd got the result they so badly wanted.
The black strength forsook him. He had no chance to win. He fought like a brave fellow, but was forced to give in.
This day, the capabilities displayed by Molyneux electrified all the best judges in the prize ring. His contest with Cribb will be long remembered in the sporting world, and it will not be forgotten, if justice holds the scale, that it was his colour alone that prevented him from becoming the hero of that fight.
It is one of those defining moments for sport. Whether the country was ready to have a black champion is impossible to know. Your gut feeling in reading everything is no, they weren't.
It must have been a shattering blow to Richmond to lose in those circumstances. I've no doubt he thought of the title as being his, if you know what I mean, although Molyneux was the man who was out there.
To Mr. Thomas Cribb, 20th of December, 1810. Sir, our friends think that last Tuesday we should have won the battle. We therefore challenge you to a second meeting at any time, for such a sum as the gentlemen who place confidence in you may be pleased to arrange. I trust that our being of a different color will not in any way operate to our prejudice. Signed, Bill Richmond and Tom Molyneux.
But the right to challenge Cribb a second time didn't come cheap. As Molyneux's backer, Bill was required to put up a purse of 600 guineas. Cribb himself had little stomach for another fight. The one-time coal heaver was now a wealthy man, and he'd been badly shaken by Molyneux. But England expected every man to do his duty. The country's top athletes were drafted in to ensure Cribb couldn't lose the return contest. Confined to a secret training camp, Cribb was subjected to bodily purges and the latest dietary fads. His fists were soaked in vinegar. All contact with women was forbidden. But back in London, Molyneux was having himself a ball.
He was a tremendous celebrity. He was as well known as Wellington and Napoleon. And it certainly went to his head. Also, the opportunities for going off the rails were there.
With togs of the best fashion and quality, the man of colour soon became a blade of the first magnitude. The cash flowed in fast upon him. Pleasure was the order of the day with him, and the stews of the metropolis tended to undermine his manhood.
While Molyneux burned his candle at both ends, the gossip columns relished each new excess.
Richmond was extremely unhappy and frustrated and to the point of rage at the way that Molyneux behaved, because Richmond was sure that Molyneux could beat Cribb if he would really train and really go at it. And here was this great, talented, splendid fighter throwing it away.
The rematch was fixed for September 1811, and as Molyneux's flesh grew weaker, Cribb grew stronger. The big fight was over before it had even begun. Cribb won easily. The nation's pride was secure.
Richmond has always been a most eloquent and amusing fellow, but he was never known to be so deficient in his eloquence as when Molyneux experienced defeat.
Bill's dreams of championship glory were in tatters. Molyneux had failed him.
Bill Richmond was fairly unforgiving. He had his status to maintain. I don't think that he actually had the time for Tom Molyneux. Certainly not the time to extend him further lines of credit. It became an issue of great bitterness between them, and I'm not sure if he was that concerned about Molyneux's fate.
Molyneux had been living off Bill's cash for months. Now it was time for Bill to call in his debts.
It's a tragedy for Molyneux, this breakdown in their relationship. His world literally falls apart at this stage. It must have been an extraordinary hell, and a lonely one as well.
Richmond and Molyneux never spoke again. Without Bill's support, Tom was soon checking into the debtor's jail on Horsemonger's Lane. On his release, the big man struggled on, eking out a living in carnival sideshows and traveling fairs. But the bottle had taken over, and in the year of 1818, Molyneux's liver finally gave up on him. He was 38 years old. Bill now knew he would never produce a black champion. The glory days were over. The big boxing crowds were drifting away, and a new mood was taking hold in the country.
What you'd find are arrests being made, and particularly from the 1830s. The courts really begin to do their best to throw the book at prize fighters. It would appear to be an attempt to domesticate the working class so that it will be aware of the fact that it has got to answer the factory bell, and it's got to do this 5-6 days a week.
Bill's gym was pulled down to make way for the construction of Nelson's Column and Trafalgar Square. But Bill's achievements were not forgotten. He'd lit up the world of prize fighting, both in and outside the ring, for 20 years. And in 1821, at the age of 58, Bill was formally honored at the coronation celebrations of King George IV.
It's a real fairy story, because what you see is someone who starts as a slave, and by his own enterprise and immense courage, there he is, receiving one of the highest honors he could get. He's absolutely made it.
I mean, he would have been immensely proud. You can imagine what he wore that day, you know. He would have polished his buttons for days on end, you know, until he could see his black face in it. It would have been a moment of pride for him. Now imagine, only boxing could have taken him that way.
Next, an animated short film, Stonehouse Reunion.